You're listening to Mammal Watching with Charles Foley and John Hall. You can find other episodes at mammalwatching.com/podcast.
Welcome to the Mammal Watching podcast with me, John Hall from New York.
And me, Charles Foley in Minneapolis. John, how are you?
I am a bit jet lagged, Charles, but I'm okay. I just got back from a work trip to Thailand. And the work part was a lot of fun because I'm working with the nature team now in the UN. And I've really found my people finally. I can sit down at lunch with some random colleague from the Philippines and get into a conversation about the latest news on cloud rat populations. Whereas I think 99.9% of people in the UN wouldn't know a cloud rat from a kebab. And then, of course, I had a few days either end to look for bats. So I've seen a bunch of species. I don't quite know which ones yet, but I'm sure most of them will be new. So I think I've finally succeeded in seeing over 1/3 of the world's mammals.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Wow. Wow. Cool. Congratulations.
It's only taken me 32 years, but if I can live another 60, I'm in with a shot. So that was fun. And I've got to share this story with you. I'm chuckling about this story. There's a guy in Australia called Janico Kelk, who is a photographer, a really talented photographer who's just moved up to North Queensland. And he is also a big fan of the podcast, so of course I like him. And he had a funny anecdote about some work he was doing in Tasmania. He was photographing wombats. They were watching a burrow and they'd been there all day, so the animals had gotten quite used to him. But he said it started to rain. So in Tasmania, the rain's pretty cold, so he was sheltering with his head and his camera inside a bin bag. And he decided to, that's a trash bag for Americans, and he decided to listen to the podcast to pass the time. And he put the music on and he heard this sort of grunting noise, and a wombat came out and was charging his feet. So he stopped listening. I sort of looked at the wombat, then the wombat retreated to its burrow. He put the podcast back on again and the wombat came out. So every time the wombat heard the banjo music, it stirred something deep within its soul. I don't know if that was the Foley effect that he had worked such wonders on that echidna, or whether it just didn't like the music, but it's amusing. Banjos and wombats are a thing. So thank you, Janica, for that. It's a great story.
Oh, that's just great. one for the ages.
Yeah, absolutely. And you, much more interestingly, you just got back from Bolivia, so you've got some stories. I've heard a little bit about them. How was it?
Oh, it was wonderful, John. It was truly wonderful. So yes, I spent 10 days in the central region of Bolivia, close to Santa Cruz, where an Australian chap called Nick McPhee runs a wildlife-based tour company, and he's been doing this for a number of years. And he sent in a couple of trip reports. I think it was in about 2019, mentioning that he had found a really good place to see jaguars. And obviously for jaguars, most people head to the Pantanal, where they're pretty much a guarantee these days. But several mammal watchers have visited Bolivia with Nick, and they had posted really interesting trip reports. So I thought it was time to make a visit. And I traveled there with some friends. It was James Schiffer, Mac Hunter, and Aram Calhoun. And we spent 4 days at a farm that Nick calls Jaguarland, and another 4 days at the Caia National Park, which is in the Grand Chaco. And we had a great trip. We saw some pretty spectacular cat sightings. We saw 2 jaguars, 3 ocelots, 2 pumas, and a jaguarundi, as well as lots of other cool mammals. And what's interesting is that Jaguarland is basically a working farm, complete with tractors, combine harvesters, etc., which are also just driving around. And 70% of the farm is farmed for soya and corn. However, the owner doesn't actually allow any hunting on his property, and as a result, the wildlife thrives there. And the farm seems to have a really high density of jaguars. And I find it really interesting to see just how quickly animal populations can rebound and start thriving if they're left alone. And, frankly, more farms could become important wildlife areas if they also adopted the same no hunting policy. So that was great. And Caia there was a very different feel to it. So it's a massive protected area in real true wilderness. It's mostly comprised of chaco, which is an impenetrable thicket with only one or two roads, and it's hot and there are lots of mosquitoes. And you can go for long periods of time in the chaco without seeing anything. But when you do see things, they tend to be pretty special. And we had an amazing sighting that we actually posted on mammalwatching.com of what we believe was a puma using a tapir as a stalking horse. Now, a stalking horse, it's actually a strategy by which human hunters will hide behind a horse or another domestic animal to get close to prey so they can hunt it. And the prey sees the domestic animal and ignores it as it's not a threat, which allows the hunter to get within shooting range. So we were driving along the road at night when we saw a large adult tapir walking along, and it was being closely followed by an adult puma. And the weird thing was that the tapir could clearly see the puma, which would sometimes walk 3 or 4 meters behind it and sometimes directly alongside it. And yet the tapir was completely unconcerned. So obviously, it was too big a prey for the puma to take down. But the puma would stop and sniff at things and then catch up with the tapir. So it appeared to be in hunting mode. And this went on for about 700 meters before the tapir finally walked off the road, followed by the puma. So anyway, we are currently checking to see if we can find any other instances in the literature of this sort of behavior. And we hope to publish the record as a note shortly. So all in all, a great trip, and really I cannot recommend Nick and his team highly enough. He's figured out that it's easy to keep clients happy if you serve them really good food and lots of cold beer, but they work incredibly hard and really go just flat out at all hours of the day and night to find the wildlife. So well worth a visit, particularly if you want to bolster your cat list.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm so glad you had such a good trip. Yeah, really. Yeah, I'm actually going to go next year. I can't resist anymore. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'm going with Nick as well. Just a question on Jaguar land. Did the farmers stop hunting for reasons that weren't to do with tourism, or is it did he see the potential of ecotourism?
It was a little hard to discern.
Yeah,
I think he is an extremely wealthy landowner, and he stopped hunting for his own best reasons. Yeah. But obviously it has had a big impact. Now, unfortunately, some of the surrounding areas continue to hunt the wildlife, but on his land, the animals, they have simply got used to people. And we were on foot about 50 yards away from a jaguar, and really it wasn't terribly concerned.
Wow. Maybe that must be about the premier cat watching site in the Americas. To see all those species in such a short time, it's incredible.
I think so. And I've just heard of one group that has just come back from Kaya, where I believe they saw 5 species of cat. So jaguar, puma, ocelot, jaguarundi, and Jeffrey's cat, all within the space of 24 hours.
Wow.
So, yeah, that's quite remarkable. I think that's probably a bit of a record. But still, it just shows you the potential of this place.
Wow, what a place! Well, I'm looking forward to seeing your trip report and your pictures. I hope you're working on that already.
Yes, sir.
All right, so we have a guest.
So our guest today is John Newby. John is an expert on desert wildlife and ecosystems, having worked in deserts in Africa for most of his life. He first went to Africa to work in Chad in 1972 and subsequently worked in Niger as the WWF and IUCN representative, and later led WWF's Africa program based out of Switzerland for many years. In 2000, he founded the Sahelo-Saharan Interest Group to help raise awareness of desert fauna and flora, and in 2004, he co-founded the Sahara Conservation Fund, which he still is linked with today. John is currently a conservation fellow at the St. Louis Zoo, a research fellow at the Smithsonian Institute, and a scientific collaborator at the Institut Royal de Sciences Naturelles in Belgium. John Newby, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming, John. It's great to see you finally, to meet you.
Now, John, you have worked as a conservationist since the early 1970s. Could you please tell us a bit about your path to becoming a wildlife conservationist?
Well, I think by circumstances, I was almost destined to become a conservationist or an environmentalist. My father was a farm laborer, and we were, a fairly modest family, modest background, and brought up in the countryside where really, if you weren't interested in the countryside, there wasn't a lot else there to be interested in. You were basically in the countryside, walking around, seeing wildlife was on the doorstep almost every day. And so if there was any sort of interest in wildlife at all, it was really there. And so one very quickly gets to know what's around you. You meet hedgehogs on a daily basis. You know the bird life fairly well. You meet badgers and foxes. You meet a lot of species just being there and not really trying too hard, because you're pretty much part of what's going on in nature around you. And there's no other distractions. Either we didn't have television at home, we were a long way from the nearest town. So basically it was, one was immersed in nature whether one wanted it or not. And it really fascinated me from a very, very young age. I was always curious about wildlife, curious about the animals that were living around. I wanted to know who they were, where they came from, what they did. And so it was a pretty easy step, I would say, moving from a youth spent in nature and wildlife to higher school and then university, where I studied zoology at Aberdeen University. And Aberdeen University was one of the premier universities for environmental work and ecology. There was some wonderful ecology programs going on at the time in the estuaries along the Scottish coast, but also the grouse moorlands, the hills, the interior, the Teesside, the Cairngorms. There was a lot of research work going on. So again, there was a natural draw towards nature in the wild rather than nature in the laboratory.
And then you traded the Highlands of Scotland for Chad. I think it's one of your very first jobs, I understand, which is a simply spectacular place for desert wildlife. Were you already enthralled by the desert and its fauna at that point, or is that something that came over time when you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was a total accident. I mean, it just deserts were nowhere on my horizon. I didn't know a first thing about them, and I never imagined I would be going to live and eventually pass most of my professional lifetime in desert environments. The story, I mean, the short version of the story is, here we are in the fourth year of a 4-year zoology degree. I had no particular prospects. I had a few ideas about getting out into the wild. I went to see the British Antarctic Survey people to see whether there was anything going on down there. But that's what one did at that time. Where there was a whole group of us went down to London to suss out what was going on. That's the sort of things one looked for when you were a wildlife orientated background, had a background in zoology. And so one day, out of the blue, a notice appeared on the laboratory notice board saying that the United Nations was looking for a wildlife biologist to go and work in Chad with the National Parks Directorate there. And so three mates in the last year of college, we all applied, and we all went down to London together, and we all interviewed together. And I would say that I was the least favorable or the least favored candidate on paper. I had really no background whatsoever. My friends who applied were a lot more, shall we say, suited for this type of position. But for one reason or another, I got the job. And so all of a sudden I was presented with this opportunity of traveling to Chad, a country I had difficulty finding on the map. Partly because they didn't send me to Chad directly. They sent me to Chad via Ghana, via Nigeria and via Cameroon.
Oh, wow.
And so it was part of getting to Chad was a major geography lesson for me in learning where all of these places were. All I know is I had a plane ticket to get me to Fort Lamy, which was the capital of Chad at that time. So when I arrived in Chad, my boss, the director of the parks department, was an expatriate, was a Frenchman by the name of Michel Anna. Now, Michel Anna was one of the last, should we say, colonialists of the newly independent Chadian authorities, if you like. He was a great buddy with the president of the time, and he was mad keen about setting up protected areas. He was very much responsible for setting up Zakuma National Park, and a whole bunch of other protected areas which were established in the late 50s and early 60s, and making Chad one of the most highly developed protected area countries in Africa at the time. They had protected areas in each of the major biomes, which was quite an achievement. But anyway, Michel Anna said, right, we're going to send you deep down south. So the job that was announced was nothing to do with deserts. It was just to be a wildlife biologist. I had zero knowledge of African wildlife and zero knowledge of being a wildlife biologist. This was me fresh from university. So it was quite an interesting opportunity, shall we say, quite a daunting task. So anyway, Michel Anna packed me off to Manda National Park. Now, Manda National Park is in the deep south of Chad. It's basically Sudano-Guinean forest and savanna. And I was asked to help the local park manager develop a park management plan for Manda National Park and just basically be there to give him some assistance regarding wildlife management. So now he was obviously a far more experienced person than I was, but I did my best. And one of the key species down there was the Derby eland. And so my first task that I gave myself was to study the Derby eland, just to try and find out more about this last small population that lived in Manda National Park. This was, should we say, this was the jewel in the crown of Manda National Park, was this herd of Derby eland. Now, since it's a pretty shy species, as you know, it wasn't the animals weren't seen very often. And so it was a question of me going to them rather than them coming to me. Although the final solution was somewhat of a compromise, I managed to suss out their favorite drinking holes and built some temporary hides in and around the drinking holes, the watering holes, and basically spent days and days and days waiting for wildlife to come to these water holes, which was quite interesting because on a number of occasions, my little flimsy hide built out of wicker grasswork was brushed up on by various antelopes coming down to the water, including on one day quite a large herd of elephants which just walked right past me down to the water's edge and right the way back again. As you can imagine, I was pretty scared what was going on at that time. But eventually, the Derby eland, they did come to the water holes, and they were very regular in their timing, usually between about 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock, the hottest time of the day. They would just appear. They would just appear out of the savannah without any sound whatsoever, just gravitate towards the water, drink for a few moments, and then just disappear back into the bush again. Very, very discrete species, but I was able to get some idea of the population size by just sitting there and watching what was going on. When the wet season began, late May, early June of 1972, my boss, Michel Anna, flew back down again to Manda National Park. He'd just got his pilot's license because WWF had given him a little aircraft, a Piper Cherokee. And he was really keen to use this aircraft. So he wrote me in to fly back with him to the capital of Chad. He says, right, you can't work here any longer because there's too much water. You'll just get drowned in all of this water. You just can't get around. We're going to go to the desert. So this was the first thing I heard of it. Now, and on the way to the desert, we dropped in to Zakuma National Park, which is where he himself had, not only did he have his own private headquarters there, but a nice little house in the savannah there in Zakuma. As you know, an incredible national park. And in those days, it was before the losses of elephants in the 1990s. So there were thousands of elephants to see there. It was really a tremendous place. But anyway, we spent a couple of days there, and then we flew on up to Arada, which is on the edge of the desert. It's on the edge of the Wadi Rime Wadi Ashim Game Reserve. So Anna, he dropped me off there and said, right, I'd like you to carry on working as you've been doing down south and give the local team here a hand in trying to suss out, how best to manage the wildlife of Wadi Rime, Wadi Ashim, in particular, looking at species like oryx, scimitar-horned oryx, addax, dama gazelles. At that time, there was still some cheetah in the Wadi Rime, Wadi Ashim. There were even some wild dogs in the Wadi Rime, Wadi Ashim Reserve. They were all pretty much on their way out at that time, but the carnivores were on the way out through persecution. But anyway, so I spent the next 6 months working on Camelback, doing patrol work with the park rangers and collecting information and data on scimitar-horned oryx, on addax, when we saw them. And the scimitar-horned oryx, we were basically in savanna grassland, in Sahel grassland. So it was really not addax habitat. They did come down, a few animals came down during the end of the dry season to find grazing and shelter, shade, but it was primarily scimitar-horned oryx habitat. Dama gazelles were abundant. Dorcas gazelles, we didn't even bother counting because they were just everywhere. Wow. There was a lot of wildlife, and there was very little development. There were very, very few vehicles. There was poaching was taking place, but it was traditional poaching. The poachers on horseback mostly, using spears to run down oryx during the hot season when the oryx are a lot more stressed by the heat. And they tend to gather, spend the days in the shade, and it was fairly easy then for the hunters to approach the oryx over the dune tops and then spy out what's going on below. And then they would, on their 2 or 3 horses, they would just chase after the animals until they became tired and they were able to approach them and stab them with their spears. At that time, there was quite a lot of people employed in hunting. I mean, not employed, but it wasn't a business. It was more of a subsidiary activity that people could do at that time of the year. It wasn't commercial in any way, shape, or form. I think they were quite effective, but the impact was relatively little because there were relatively few people hunting and there were relatively large numbers of animals to hunt. And there was by no means any guarantee that any hunting party would get any oryx in any case. So anyway, so I did my 6 months, and lo and behold, Michel Anna turned up again in his little airplane, and it's Christmas time, and he said, "Right, we're going back to the south again." And I said, "Well, hang on a second. Do you mind if I stay here? I rather like working in the desert. I rather like working with the people here. The species are really fascinating." And he looked at me and said, "Well, they're just as important as the ones down south. Sure, you can stay here." And that went on. I carried on working there until the late 1970s when civil war broke out. And at that time, it was impossible to work there. The whole place was a mess. There was a lot of traffic, a lot of arms, a lot of armed factions, a lot of splintering of quasi-governments, and then the country was then invaded by Libyan forces, occupied right down into the reserve area. So it was that time, really, that period between 79 and, should we say, 82, that the scimitar-horned oryx really disappeared. That's where the fatal blow came during that period. Right. Up until then, there was probably I don't know, there's probably 5,000 or 6,000 oryx left in the reserve.
Wow.
What I didn't know, because my experience was limited at that time, and I just didn't have the helicopter view of the whole overall situation. Based on what I could see in Wadi Rimeh, Wadi Hashim, I used to be able to see oryx nearly every day if I wanted to. I knew where they were, I knew where to find them. And they were there in sizable numbers. That wasn't the case elsewhere, and what has become apparent, obviously, since then, or what became apparent, the more work we did in the 1980s and 90s, was the Chadian population was basically the last really viable population of scimitar horned oryx left in the whole of Africa. There were remnants at that time in Mali, and there were remnants in Niger, but they were at that time remnants there, whereas we had this healthy little population isolated in the center of Chad, which just happened to become the front line of civil war and civil unrest during a long enough period for all of the wildlife to be basically exterminated.
Awful.
Wow.
I think I heard stories of huge sort of herds of Dharma gazelle back in the 70s. I mean, now there's 200 left in the wild, maybe, is that right? Or most of which are in Wadi Rimeh, I guess. But what was it like when you first got there with the Dharmas?
Well, the Dharma gazelle was abundant.
Wow.
It was an abundant species. They were in all the wadis. They were all in all the wadis and the should we say the better wooded grasslands. There came a time when I was working on camelback, and I was concentrating most of my effort on scimitar horned oryx, which were pretty flighty even then in the 70s. They weren't approachable. Dharma gazelles were fairly approachable. Dorcas gazelles, if you're on camelback, they didn't pay you any attention. Scimitar horned oryx, if you were exposed on top of a camel, the scimitar horned oryx were off as soon as they could see you. So they were a lot more difficult to work with.
Yeah.
And basically I prioritized them out of the picture. I focused much more on the scimitar horned oryx, not even thinking at that time that there was going to be any significant danger. Yeah, don't forget, here am I, a 22, 23-year-old inexperienced field biologist that really had very little grasp or understanding of the global nature of some of these issues. I mean, that has only come later.
Yeah. Wow.
And you mentioned earlier that the addax, it wasn't really their habitat, but what sort of numbers were you seeing during the early days?
Well, it was really good because addax would come out of the desert. We did have in the far north of the Wadi Rimeh Reserve, there is proper addax desert country with moving dunes and the rest of it. I mean, really, it is addax habitat up there. Because of the logistical difficulties of actually getting there, I was camel based at the time, so that I couldn't get into the desert. It was far too far away and far too difficult. There's no water. You would have to have mounted a real significant expedition. But what happened was at that time, during the dry season, addax would come down into the Sahel desert fringe, and they'd come down to some of the more heavily wooded wadis, and they would be there for shade, and they'd be there for vegetation, green vegetation. Now, this was just a few odd animals, but they used to turn up regularly. We'd maybe see 10, 15 a year. The whole game changed in about 1974 when I acquired a Land Rover. Now, in 1974, with a Land Rover, then I had a lot more liberty. I had a lot more autonomy in terms of what I could do, where I could go, how long I could stay in the field. So then it became much more easy to start working on the desert fringes and see what was going on up there. Now, what happens in the wet season is the scimitar horned oryx, and to a certain extent the Dharma gazelles and the addax, they're very, I wouldn't say they were migratory, but they're certainly nomadic in their behavior. And as soon as the rains start to fall, and as soon as the good grazing starts to come through, you'll find a general movement of wildlife into these areas very, very quickly. Normally speaking, the rains come from the south and they go further north as the rainy season develops. They go from south to north. So usually the wildlife will move from south to north following the rains as they go north and the developing grazing. In 1974, what happened, the rains started in the north better than they did in the south. And so the animals went directly north. They didn't move slowly. They went directly to the north. Now, the addax that were sitting further north still of the rains all came south. And that's when on one memorable day, I saw more than 1,000 oryx and more than 200 addax in one single area, one basin, one huge basin that was full of the most wonderful young vegetation. Everything was in there, Dharma gazelles, Dorcas gazelles. We even found one damalisk, one topee, corrigum, I think it's called.
Wow.
The corrigum. The corrigum and topee, whatever you call it, they used to migrate from the sort of the northern edge of the savannah, such as, the Zakuma type ecosystem. They used to migrate north with the rains when there were bigger populations of topee. At that time, if the rainfall kept going and there was no significant break in the rainfall, they would go as far north as the 15th parallel, almost to the 16th parallel if the grazing was there. And they used to be a frequent and regular visitor during the month of July and August in the Wadi Rimeh Reserve. A reserve where they are by no means resident. It's far too dry for them year round. There's no freestanding water. But they're drawn northwards. And the topee was well known for its northwards migrations into the Sahel. Here we are in this wide open basin. There's not a tree to be seen for dozens of kilometers. And all the wildlife is just collected in that area there. It was absolutely fantastic. The wildlife was literally uncountable. I got to about 1,000 scimitar oryx and then gave up. Things were moving around backwards and forwards. We weren't disturbing them at all because we just happened to come over the right rim to the south of this basin. And then with the binoculars, it was all there. I mean, it was just like something out of, I don't know, Serengeti in the Sahel. It was just amazing. And that happened again in 1975. Big numbers of scimitar oryx collecting in areas of new grazing. Addax as well coming into those areas. But then from 1976 onwards, the situation began to degrade seriously. There was a lot more traffic. There was a lot more, and it was all evil traffic. There were people gun running backwards and forwards. There were militia. And since the Wadi Rimeh, Wadi Hashim Reserve is smack bang in the middle of Chad, and there's no real infrastructure there whatsoever, basically it was an open space, relatively easy to drive around, and just allowed people to move from north to south, from east to west. And so there was a lot of traffic across that area, a lot of people with arms, and it just compromised our work.
Sad, huh? How those astonishing numbers of animals can disappear so quickly.
But it's you said you were going to ask me maybe about some of the highlights of my that would definitely be a highlight. But what is a bigger highlight? A bigger highlight is today, after having rewilded the scimitar oryx, we are finding herds of over 100 oryx together. Now it just goes to show that there is potential for those animals to come back and do what they did before. It's the conditions are there, the habitat is there. I mean, they haven't lost it in terms of their ability to function. Yeah. And we're starting to see again the sites that would be fairly familiar in the 1970s, which is really heartwarming. I mean, it really demonstrates the positive side of all of this.
Indeed.
Yeah, and how resilient those ecosystems are, so long as there remains a source population that these animals can be replenished from. Now, moving on to Niger. So in 1980, you moved from Chad, and you went to Niger to help set up the Antenere National Nature Reserve, which is a huge area. How does that country compare with Chad in terms of, well, both scenic beauty and wildlife?
I don't think there's much to choose. I mean, if you look at Chad and Niger on the map, Niger is long east to west, which means it probably has less diversity in terms of biomes. Chad is a lot more long north to south, and so it crosses through a lot more biomes. So in Chad, you've actually got all the way from, pure real desert in the north, all the way down to Sudano-Guinean forest in the south, whereas Niger is much more homogeneous. But in terms of the desert environment, the landscapes, I mean, Niger is absolutely spectacular, where you really appreciate what deserts are really like in terms of the diversity of desert, is just seeing the interface between mountain and desert. It's when it all clashes together. There you see the sand doing amazing things, and the erosion of the rock face, the mountain, providing all of that immense palette of colors, which really marks desert scenery. It's quite remarkable, that interface. And Niger, especially the Aïr Mountains, where they border onto the Tenere Desert, they have several hundred kilometers of interface between pure desert and pure mountain. I mean, it's quite spectacular, that interface. Chad is very spectacular. The Enedi area of Chad, the Tibesti area of Chad. I mean, there's really not much difference. I don't think there's much difference. I mean, both of them are desert textbooks. Really, whenever I remember driving through the Tibesti a few years back, and I saw what they call a yardang. A yardang is a I remember from my geology days at university, a yardang is an eroded pillar, usually in series. And I was driving along and I saw this picture of several yardangs. And I thought to myself, that had to be from my geology textbook, because that's exactly what it was.
And in terms of the wildlife in the Aïr Reserve, were you seeing pretty much the same species, or different species, different densities? How was that?
Well, why were we in the Aïr? I think that's the first question to ask. As Chad started to go bad, it was pretty obvious that it was going to get worse before it got better. So in about 1978, I started looking for alternatives, because I realized by then that what Chad had was pretty unique. And I didn't really know too much about what was happening elsewhere. But I knew that we had to start looking for alternatives. Should Chad go under and the oryx go under with it, what are we going to do? So Niger was an obvious option. So I started to look at Niger and look at places that had a similar ecology and a similar sort of socio-ecological, socio-economical sort of perspective to them, which meant you could get large landscapes with relatively low human impact, where the wildlife tended to be fairly resilient, was able to hang on. It's where land is converted very rapidly, either for agriculture or through desertification or encroachment. You tend to lose your wildlife first, of course, especially your larger species. They're quickly lost. And so I was looking for places that had similar characteristics to Wadi Rimé, Wadi Hashim. And the area approximated most of Wadi Rimé, Wadi Hashim was an area called Termite. Now, the Termite area, it's a low mountain massif, a low mountain range, about 100 kilometers long, completely bordered and surrounded by desert. So it was much more, if you like, it was much more of an addax habitat than it was a scimitar-horned oryx habitat. But scimitar-horned oryx were there almost as a relic species, because they'd been hunted out of other areas. They'd congregated around the area of Termite, because there was very, very low population density. There was no development. There was no infrastructure. So they kind of had a hideaway sort of place there. So the initial goal was to go to Niger and then go to Termite and do an assessment. Unfortunately, when we arrived in Niger, the government forbade us to go because of the problems in Chad. They figured we'd be too close to Chad, when in reality, you're a long way from Chad in Termite. But the government said, no, you can't go there. Just you better turn around and go home again. And we said, no way we're turning around and going home. We've mobilized vehicles and people and a crew. I brought down a crew from Europe, from the Zoological Society of London, and a logistics team from Lincolnshire, Land Rovers, and all this kind of stuff. We were going to do a major job of finding the next Wadi Rime, Wadi Hashim. And we managed to argue a case with the Minister of the Environment, and he said, okay, termites off the circuit, but you can go north if you wish to go north. So we went to the Aïr. We also went to the area between the Aïr Mountains, which is in central North Niger, as you know, and the Malian border, what they call the Temesna area, which is classic oryx habitat out there towards the Mali border. So we did survey work in Mali, on that Mali-Niger border area, and then we moved into the Aïr. And the Aïr quickly sold itself to us very rapidly as being really the place to do something. We couldn't get to termite, so we decided what we'd do is we'd focus on the Aïr and the Tenere. There was still a sizable addax population there. There were Dharma gazelles there. There was a major ostrich population, several hundred ostriches, and breeding very well, a very dynamic ostrich population. Lots of Dorcas gazelles, and a lot of other stuff besides. A lot of the small carnivores there. The cheetah was there. Incredible bird life because you had that diversity of habitats, which made it so rich. So it had a lot going for it. So we swapped horses, if you like, and focused on Aïr and Tenere. Had we not done that, we would have probably did what we did in the 1990s, and that was set up a Termit and Tintuma National Nature Reserve, which came a decade later.
Oh, okay. So you did end up working in Termit eventually.
Oh yeah, very much so, yeah. And that led to the establishment of the Termit and Tintuma National Nature Reserve.
Right. Termit is, I remember there was still a few addax hanging in there. Were there all scimitar horned oryx over there?
Well, there were scimitar horned oryx at one time. The only oryx I've ever seen in Niger, living wild oryx in Niger, were in the Aïr Mountains. But we found plenty of signs of oryx in Termit. There were plenty of horns, a few trophies found here and there. And the local people also confirmed that the oryx were in and around the massif. Not really their habitat, a little bit too arid, a little bit too on the fringe. The oryx really like that Sahelian grassland. They like the prairie. That's really where they do best. But as is the case with Dharma gazelles today, the majority of the remaining populations of Dharma gazelles are not in true Dharma gazelle habitat. They're in areas where they can survive and where they can escape from hunting pressure. So they've moved into the mountains. They've moved into the mountains and onto the plateaus, which is not really classic Dharma gazelle habitat at all. Dharma gazelles is a Sahelian woodland species. It's a Sahelian sparse acacia savanna, acacia woodland, grassland species. But they've been pushed into these plateaus, these mountain plateaus in the Aïr, in Termit, and nowhere else to go basically, and they're just hanging on in very, very small numbers. But it's just not sustainable. They're going to get picked off one at a time, and there just isn't the carrying capacity up there for them to expand numbers in any significant way.
Right. And what is the current status of conservation efforts in Niger? Because obviously there's been instability in the country for a while, and there's just been a coup over there. What are you hearing?
Hearing no good news, I can tell you. Basically, the military authorities have asked all non-governmental organizations, especially the international ones, to no longer work in what they would consider to be military zones, without telling us what those military zones are. We're still trying to find out where we can operate and where we can't operate. we have a number of projects in Niger, which are currently being impacted. Again, it's still too early to know what we can do and what we can't do. So we're kind of waiting for more information and more news.
Yeah.
Not good though.
No, doesn't sound good at all.
But it's a double whammy. It's a double whammy, like in many cases in areas like Niger, is that donor confidence is very low. It's to non-existent, and so people aren't willing to provide the funding, and we can't do the work because of logistical and security issues. So it's just kind of you're basically trying to do something with no resources or very, very limited resources. So it's very difficult to demonstrate to the donors that we can operate, functionally and achieve something. Now, when your donors are people like the European Union and French government, it's even more difficult because they themselves are politically caught up in the shenanigans as well. So it's really, we don't know what's going on. It's going to be interesting to see how it pans out.
Sure. That must be extremely frustrating.
Yeah.
Very sad. So this, I think the work you're talking about now is with the Sahara Conservation Organization. And I understand you founded that in 2004. You helped found it. Can you tell us how that came about and what they do, basically?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. SCF was created because no one else was doing anything about desert wildlife, especially not endangered desert species. WWF wasn't interested in deserts. IUCN wasn't really interested in species at that time. I'd worked for 28 years for WWF and just got increasingly more and more frustrated that deserts were being overlooked. It's the flip side to the biodiversity hotspots thing. At that time, biodiversity hotspots, we're talking 20 odd years ago, 25 years ago, biodiversity hotspots was the big thing at the time. And there was a lot of hype around classification of if you're a hotspot, high biodiversity and all of this. But the flip side of that coin is there's a whole bunch of other areas that are worthy of conservation funding and money and effort, but don't end up on the radar screen because it's being dominated by the hotspots, which was absolutely the case with deserts in North Africa. In 1998, the Convention on Migratory Species, CMS, held a workshop in Djerba in Tunisia to develop an action plan for endangered Sahelo-Saharan antelopes, which was a fantastic initiative for the time. I mean, these people were really speaking the right language at the time. And so I went to that meeting in 1998, listened to my colleagues from Chad and Niger and other places talk about the lack of information, the lack of action. When they put together their action plans, they were basing it on the same sort of data I looked at when I was a wildlife biologist there, 10, 20 years earlier. They really had zero capacity and zero data upon which to really base action. And so this kind of got me thinking about, well, so what can we do? What can we do to at least generate enough information so that these countries could put together some plausible action plans that they could then look for donor support for to implement, because they just didn't have the baseline information. So from that meeting and a few of the people who were at that meeting, and plus a few other sort of close friends who were into desert antelopes, we got together and in 2000 created what we called the Sahelo-Saharan Interest Group, which was an informal group of like-minded individuals who were keen to do something. We were all employed otherwise. I was still with WWF at that time. My close friend and colleague Steve Montfort was at the Smithsonian. Terry Carell was at the Living Desert Zoo in California. There were people, Tim Waite, Tim Woodfine were players at the time, and they were at Marwell and ZSL. So there were people all over the place doing their own thing. But all of them, there was this common thread of this interest in desert wildlife, and especially desert ungulates. So we created this little group, SSIG, in 2000, with a view to raising money to undertake at least 3-4 field missions to go and collect data on the status quo of the desert wildlife, so that we had some up-to-date information and data on just what the situation was with oryx, with addax, with dama gazelles, with Dorcas gazelles, with the carnivore populations. Initially we did 4 major surveys in Chad and Niger. We focused our effort on Chad and Niger, figuring that that's where the best chances lay to try and do something. And we came back with quite a lot of really good information, and very useful information for the governments we were working with. All of this work was carried out in partnership with the relevant wildlife authorities. And so for the first time in many, many years, they actually had recent data, not only on the current status of species, but also where the best bets were to do something about their conservation. We had a good idea of what the threats were, etc. So they could build a plausible case for donor support regarding some restoration conservation work. So, after a couple of years of functioning like that, and functioning very well, we raised quite a lot of money for these survey work, and we started to create a little bit of a wave of interest in desert wildlife, in Sahelo-Saharan wildlife. And we came to the conclusion in 2003 that an informal group of like-minded individuals wasn't enough. It didn't have enough, should we say, infrastructure or legal footing. And so we decided to establish a non-governmental organization. The Sahara Conservation Fund was the child. Now, we keep running the Sahelo-Saharan Interest Group to this day. It's now in its 22nd or 23rd iteration. And it has become the major forum for discussing wildlife conservation in the Sahel and Sahara. We have people coming from not just the Sahel and Sahara, but outside the region as well. We have people from all walks of life coming each year to our meetings, with a view just simply to sharing information, building partnerships, creating friendships, leading to a better, understanding and opportunity to do something about desert conservation. I think that's one of our greatest achievements, has been the establishment of this forum. People are now talking about addax and scimitar-horned oryx. 20 years ago, no one even knew what the bloody hell they were. They're talking about them as if they were the bread and butter of conservation. They are on the radar screen. Chad is on the radar screen of conservation. Niger is on the radar screen. And I like to think that we've done a lot to make that happen by promoting these areas, promoting these species. And I think that's been one of the major achievements of Sahara Conservation Fund.
About 15 years ago, I did try to encourage WCS to work in some of these areas, but they never took it up. So I'm very glad that you did. And what are some of FCF's main projects at the moment?
Well, in Chad, it's rewilding. I mean, this is what we're focused mainly on. I mean, as you know, we've brought back the scimitar-horned oryx to Chad. We now have a herd of over 600 wild oryx in Wadi Rimeh, Wadi Hashim. We used that oryx rewilding program as a springboard for addax. And now we have, it'll soon be up to 180, maybe at the end of the year, it'll be about 200 addax back in Chad. Dama gazelles, we have a native population in the Wadi Rimeh Reserve of around about 50, 60, which is probably 2/3 of the world's wild population. And we are now engaged in a captive breeding program. We have over 20 Dama gazelles in captivity, with a view to building up numbers, boosting the wild population to try and get it to some kind of sustainable number.
Sorry, where do most of these animals come from? Presumably they're all coming from captive populations?
Yeah, they're all coming from captive operations. They're all sourced through the breeding program in Abu Dhabi, run by the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi. They have been an incredible supporter, an amazing partner on this whole operation. They've invested really heavily in this international program. So the ADACs also are sourced from their collection. Now, don't forget, their collections are also sourced from other collections. We've done genetics on the ADACs. We've got full genome sequences now for scimitar oryx and dama gazelles. Many of the scimitar oryx came from Chad in the first place anyway, through captures that took place in the 1960s, which makes an interesting story. I mean, especially an interesting story to tell to the Chadians. When you're bringing scimitar oryx back, you're bringing back the children of Chad. You're bringing back part of Chad's heritage. The prodigal son that they lost 60 years ago, 50 years ago, is back home again, and that has a lot of power as a communications message in Chad. We've had a lot of support from Chadians for the scimitar oryx. It's an iconic species. It's iconic largely because it was very prominent in wildlife lore and culture because of its huntability. But it's also a lot of the nomadic pastoralist people see it as an indicator species of environmental health, and the bounty of the good Lord. If there wasn't wildlife in the desert, why would the good Lord bring rainfall? And that is very much part of the philosophy that people talk about. So this is wildlife acting as an ambassador for itself almost. The dama gazelles have primarily come from, we've had some dama gazelles from Abu Dhabi that were probably sourced from animals originally taken up from Sudan or Chad, probably in the late 1990s, the 2000s possibly. And then we've had wild captures to boost numbers and also to bring in the local genetic gene profile.
Right.
We've interestingly enough, because since we created this population of captive dama gazelles, which is very visible. The dama gazelle is a very visible gazelle, a very visible antelope, because of its bright white color. Not good if you're escaping from a hunter, but I suppose good for social cohesion. But the visibility of these animals draws in wild dama gazelles, especially male dama gazelles. They come in and they hang around the pens looking to get at the females. And so some of our wildlife staff, our local Chadian wildlife staff, cunningly have managed to set up a system where the animals walk into passageways, and then swiftly, we nip in behind them and shut them off, and so we don't have to do any kind of physical capture. The animals capture themselves with a view to proximity to the females inside the pens. That way, we've boosted the population of local dama gazelles quite easily without any kind of physical capture and intervention, which is, as you know, always a risky business.
Yeah, very clever, using females as bait. It's
So, John, I'm one of the lucky few to have actually visited Wadi Rim and seen some of your spectacular work, but it's obviously not an easy place to get to. Do you see much future for ecotourism in places like Wadi Rim to help conservation?
That's a very good question, and it's one that a lot of people ask. The governments of places like Niger and Chad are all obviously very interested in trying to develop new places for tourism and tourists. Because of obviously at the moment, because of the security issues, because of the logistics involved, the lack of infrastructure, tourism in places like Wadi Rim, Wadi Hashim are going to be niche markets. The onus is definitely on quality rather than on quantity. My big question always regarding ecotourism, and you hear so much rubbish about ecotourism, about people saying, well, it's the panacea and it's this and that and other. And when everybody's trying to sell a project, they always start talking about, oh, the ecotourism potential. I mean, the question I always ask is just how much of the money is actually going to filter down to the people whose lives are going to make a difference to conservation. And they're the people who live with this bloody wildlife, you know. These are the pastoralists that live with the antelopes in Wadi Rim, Wadi Hashim. How much tourism money, how much tourism, the benefits of tourism are going to trickle down to them to make a difference to their point of view of wildlife and its value to be conserved. If one can demonstrate there is a really practical and tangible stream, if you like, of opportunities or income, then I'm all for it. I just don't like the bullshit surrounding the word ecotourism, because when push comes to shove, getting money to the people that make a difference, where it's going to make a difference, is really difficult. It's a lot of money's creamed off before it gets anywhere near the people on the ground. And when the numbers of people who are visiting, like Wadi Rim, Wadi Hashim, I don't know how many people visit Wadi Rim. Is it 100 a year? You know, probably not. 100 a year people, and most of the people that are going there, the majority of the people go there because they want to go there. They've got an objective for going there. It's people like yourselves who want to see mammals. You're not necessarily the most wealthy people. We do get a few wealthy people coming through there that can afford to hire a helicopter and fly in and fly out and do things. They have potential, I assume, to leave money behind. I haven't seen much of it yet. So I don't know. A niche market, but a great niche market.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think how one actually gets money into the hands of the local people is often critical for whether these little niche markets, as you call them, whether they actually work or not. So
they don't generate much income. I mean, it's the nature of the beast. I'm not criticizing the niche market at all.
Yeah.
It's the nature of the beast. And the more people that come there, I mean, I'm very happy when people come, like your own groups, when they turn up. I'm really happy to be there, to be on site, to be able to talk to people, because it's a great opportunity to spread the word. It's a great opportunity to get the message out about this place and its value. I mean, Wadi Rim, Wadi Hashim today, it's the only place in the universe, let alone planet Earth, where you can see oryx and addax and dharma gazelles and Dorcas gazelles all in the same place.
Sure.
You can't see them anywhere else in the universe, in the wild.
I think, personally, I think that it is always going to be a niche market, but the niches could be a lot bigger because people just don't know about it. I mean, I didn't know about this place until very recently, and I spent the last 30 years thinking and breathing mammals to the extent of everything else. So there's definitely a job. People are catching on. I just got an email today from someone who wants to come to Chad after seeing my trip report. So slowly, a few more people. The niche will get slightly larger, I hope. But yeah, I hear what you're saying.
No, that's good, and that's good. And I think even though the message is a small message, it's the right message, and it's a good message. It's a message. It's a message that has international dimensions, which is always good. And this is kind of it's appreciated by the administration and the authorities. You know, there's good news to be heard in Chad. It isn't just bad news. You know, it's like it's very difficult to find good news about Chad and Niger. But this is good news. There's good news going on at the moment. You know, Chad has become a leader in large mammal, large wildlife conservation and protected area conservation. I mean, it's become a market leader. I mean, incredible to think about.
Yeah, and let's face it. I mean, tourism is a fickle market. I remember in Tanzania when Ebola kicked off in West Africa, which was 7,000 miles away. The Tanzania safari market collapsed, even though Paris was closer to West Africa than Tanzania was. So it's a difficult one. But if anyone's going to go to these places to look for animals, it's nutters like John and I suppose. So there will always hopefully be a few people heading out to these areas.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, a lot of people are put off just by the security issues, but the reality is, and of course the embassies don't like me saying this. The reality is that 99% of Chad is perfectly safe to go to. It's just that the whole country gets a bad rap because there are a few areas that you don't want to go to. But so long as you stay away from those areas, most of Chad is is practicable. It's it's not as easy as it might be to get around, but that's an advantage. It may be developed for whatever reason. I mean, the wildlife wouldn't be there as it is today.
Yeah.
Now, clearly, you've worked in this desert environments for close to 50 years, and you've obviously had a huge influence on conservation in the Sahara. So, looking back at your career, what would you say are the achievements that you are most proud of?
Well, obviously, I think that the reintroduction of the scimitar-horned oryx is a thing. I mean, it's particularly poignant because I'm one of the few biologists alive today, and maybe I'm the only biologist alive today that actually worked with scimitar-horned oryx when they were present in the wild. So I've been privileged, whatever that means, in inverted commas, to see this species, fall into extinction. But I've also been privileged to be part of its restoration and rise from the dead. So from a career perspective, I mean, I've done my bit. I'm happy. I'm happy with that conclusion. I don't want to stay around. I don't want to stay around too long because they might disappear again. So I mean, I've been incredibly lucky in my career. I've just, from the first day I read that card on the notice board, to finding a country to work in that I could work in, and people were accommodating and friendly, and then ability to move from Chad to Niger to pick up strings when the Civil War took over, and then the ability to just step out of a career with WWF. A lifetime career almost with WWF, and then have the opportunity of starting a new career, establishing and running Sahara Conservation Fund. I mean, I've been incredibly lucky. It's all one nice story for me.
The wildlife of Chad is lucky to have had you too. So yeah. Yeah,
well.
John, thank you so much. I'd heard people wax lyrical about your stories and your power as a communicator, and I've heard it for myself in the flesh. That was absolutely fascinating, and I was transported back to Chad and then beyond that back to a world when I was a small child with those stories. Thank you very much, and please keep on with this wonderful work you're doing to save some of those most beautiful antelope in the world.
Yeah, I intend to. Thanks very much for John. Thanks very much for the opportunity of sharing some of my bletherings with you.
Yeah, it's been absolutely fascinating, I must admit. And that story you told of coming across a sand dune and seeing 1,200 scimitar-horned oryx and 200 addax, it just warms the heart. It really does. So yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. The number gets bigger each time I tell the story.
Doesn't it always?
Thank you, John.
All right.
You've been listening to Mammal Watching with Charles Foley and John Hall. You can find other episodes at mammalwatching.com/podcast.